The alkali flats shimmered under a merciless sun where phantom riders danced in heat mirages above cracked earth near the skeletal remains of Copper Gulch. The settlement had burned 3 months prior, leaving only charred timber bones jutting from hardpan like the ribs of some colossal beast. Chaska drew rein on his paint horse, dark eyes scanning the desolation with practiced wariness. At 30, he moved with the quiet confidence of a Lakota warrior who had survived the frontier's worst offerings, but something in the stillness ahead made his hand drift toward the Sharps Model 1874 rifle across his shoulders. Movement caught his attention, not the usual dart of a jackrabbit or lazy coil of a sidewinder, but something larger, more desperate. He dismounted silently moccasined feet, soundless on sun-baked ground, as he approached what appeared to be bundled fabric near a cluster of barrel cactus. She lay face down in the dust, her cotton dress torn and darkened with blood that had baked to rust-colored stains. Bare feet, swollen and lacerated, protruded from beneath faded calico. Dark hair had escaped its careful arrangement to create a tangled veil across her shoulders, and her fingers clutched something metallic against her chest with the desperate grip of someone who had paid dearly for whatever she protected. "Miss Must." Chaska knelt beside her close enough to see the shallow rise and fall of ribs beneath torn fabric. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes snapped open, startling green like new grass after spring rain, and fixed on his face with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. She tried to push herself upright, failed, then collapsed back with a sharp intake that spoke of pain beyond simple exhaustion. Chaska's gaze traveled to her legs, where precise geometric marks scarred her shins and calves. The patterns were too deliberate for accident squares, and ladder shapes burned into flesh with methodical cruelty. Around each mark, the skin had taken on an unnatural blue-gray tinge, suggesting something more sinister than simple torture. "Easy now," he murmured, reaching for his water pouch. "Let me help." When his fingers brushed her calf to examine the wounds, she flinched violently. "It hurts," she whispered hoarsely, her voice carrying the soft music of French beneath heavily accented English. "Right here. Everywhere they touched me." The marks formed a grid pattern reminiscent of surveyor maps he'd seen railroad men carry. Someone had pressed heated metal against her skin with scientific precision, creating what looked like coordinates etched in agony and flesh. He uncorked his deerskin water pouch and began cleaning grit from the wounds with gentle efficiency. She bit back cries as water revealed the full extent of damage, not just burns, but fragments of metal embedded in the deepest marks, giving them their sickly metallic sheen. "Who did this?" he asked, positioning himself to shade her face from the brutal sun. She struggled to form words, throat working soundlessly before managing, "Men. They wanted." Her grip tightened on the brass device pressed against her chest. "This, and what Papa taught me about its secrets." A dust plume rose on the eastern horizon, not the lazy spiral of wind, but the straight line that came from horses ridden hard across open ground. Chaska's jaw tightened as he counted what appeared to be multiple riders approaching with grim purpose. "Can you ride?" he asked urgently. She nodded weakly, though her face was pale with effort. Chaska lifted her carefully, noting how light she felt despite being full-grown, how her body trembled with exhaustion and shock. He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his arms circling her waist to keep her steady against his chest. "Hold tight to me," he said against her ear. "We're about to ride like the devil himself is giving chase." As they wheeled away from the ruins, Chaska glimpsed movement in sparse vegetation. 3 coyotes that had been watching with the patience of scavengers who knew wounded prey rarely escaped for long. Behind them, the approaching riders were close enough now for hoofbeats to carry on desert wind, accompanied by the distant crack of a rifle shot that sent a bullet singing past their heads. Whatever this woman had fled was closing fast, and Chaska had just placed himself directly between her and whatever violence was coming. But something in those green eyes' pain, mixed with unbroken spirit, told him she was worth every risk that lay ahead. The brass device she clutched seemed to catch and hold sunlight like a beacon, and he had the sudden certainty that understanding its significance would be the key to keeping them both alive in the hours to come. Chaska existed between worlds, respected by his people for traditional knowledge, but mistrusted by many whites who had once employed his skills as an army scout. He carried his grandfather's bow alongside the modern rifle, wore buckskin that blended with landscape, and kept his ceremonial eagle feather bonnet carefully folded for sacred occasions that seemed increasingly rare, as railroad money bought more violence with each passing season. His younger brother, Dakota, had died 2 summers past in a skirmish near Bad River when railroad surveyors tried to run their line directly through an ancestral burial hill. The memory burned like a fresh brand, made worse by Chaska's knowledge that cooperation with the army had accomplished nothing but delay. Now he worked alone, guiding honest travelers and avoiding corrupt officials who sold Lakota land to the highest bidder. This morning, he had planned to ride to the Red Hills burial ridge to make tobacco offerings for Dakota's spirit. Instead, he found himself holding a wounded French woman whose very presence suggested the kind of trouble that got people killed on the frontier. Marguerite Delorme, the name she gasped between pained breaths, was 22 and far from the green valleys of her homeland. She had come to Dakota Territory with her father Etienne, a telegraph line operator turned surveyor who had accepted army contracts to test experimental equipment for mineral detection. The device, she explained as they rode toward distant cottonwoods marking water. Papa created it by modifying a military telegraph line telegraph key, combining galvanic cells with induction coils he studied in Paris. It detects copper deposits through electromagnetic resonance. Her words carried the clipped precision of someone trained in telegraph line operations, mixing French and English in patterns reflecting a mind comfortable with codes and technical language. Chaska examined the brass instrument when they stopped to rest the horse. After Marguerite showed him how to prime its internal battery with acid solution, it emitted a faint hum near a copper bullet casing he found in sand. The mechanism seemed fragile and temperamental, hardly worth the torture someone had inflicted to obtain it. "There has to be more to this," he said, studying the grid pattern burned into her skin. "No one brands a woman for a compass that barely functions." At Copper Gulch's remains, they found confirmation of his suspicions. Fresh boot prints in 2 different sizes scarred the ash. And among charred timbers, Chaska discovered remnants of a recent surveyor's camp, too new to have been there during the fire, still holding the scent of horses and unwashed men. In Marguerite's leather satchel, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a crumpled telegraph line message covered in pencil marks. The pattern matched her wounds exactly. Someone had used her father's own survey notes as a template for torture, pressing a heated metal grid against her skin while demanding information she might not even possess. They kept asking about secret routes through the hills. She whispered, wincing as paper brushed her wounded legs. Papa had found something valuable beneath the ground, and they needed to know exactly where it lay hidden. The pursuing riders were visible now, against morning sky, 3 men moving with the steady determination of professional hunters who knew their quarry couldn't outrun them indefinitely. Chaska urged his horse toward broken country, where arroyos and stone formations might provide cover, but he knew that carrying double would eventually cost them the race. "Why are you helping me?" Marguerite asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the rhythm of hoofbeats. Chaska considered the question as he scanned terrain ahead for defensive positions. "Because someone hurt you for knowledge they had no right to take," he said finally. "And because my brother died fighting men who thought they could steal whatever they wanted without facing consequences." He didn't mention the way her eyes had looked when she whispered about pain, or how her slight form had felt when he lifted her onto the horse. Those feelings were complications he couldn't afford when survival required clear thinking and quick action. The rifle shot cracked across the wasteland like thunder, sending splinters flying from a cottonwood just yards from where they rode. Chaska's horse shied violently, nearly unseating both riders, while the brass device in Marguerite's hands jumped as if alive. "That's far enough." The voice carried clearly across flats, edged with casual authority of men accustomed to being obeyed. "Hand over the girl and her toy, and you can ride away from this unfortunate misunderstanding." 3 riders had crested the low rise behind them, too close for escape on a single horse carrying double. Chaska cataloged details with survival-honed efficiency. The leader was a big man in a black coat, despite the heat sitting his horse like someone who expected deference. His companions were rougher specimens, hired guns with hollow eyes, and the easy violence of men who had found killing profitable. "Get down," Chaska ordered, pulling Marguerite behind a sandstone boulder that offered the only available cover. His Sharps rifle was in his hands before his feet touched earth, its familiar weight, both comforting and insufficient, against 3 armed men with clear fields of fire. The riders spread out as they approached a practiced maneuver designed to prevent clean shots at multiple targets. The leader raised one hand while keeping the other on his pistol grip. "You're harboring federal property, redskin," he called out with deliberate insult. "Official survey equipment stolen from a government operation. Hand it over, and maybe we let you keep drawing breath." Chaska's jaw tightened at the casual dismissal of both Marguerite's humanity and his own dignity. "The woman chooses her own path," he replied, his voice carrying quiet authority. "And she's not stolen property. Everything's stolen if you look at it the right way." One gunman laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Especially when it's in the wrong hands." Marguerite pressed against the boulder, still clutching the brass device. "Pike's men," she whispered urgently. "The foreman and his killers. Papa wrote about them. Avery Pike owns half the railroad contracts in the territory, and obstacles don't slow his operations for long." The name meant nothing to Chaska, but fear in her voice told him everything necessary about the men they faced. Railroad money could purchase significant violence in territory where federal law existed more in theory than practice. Wind shifted, carrying scents of horse sweat and gun oil. Chaska gauged distance, perhaps 80 yards, close enough for accurate shooting, but far enough to provide seconds if they charged. His shoulder bore an old wound from previous conflicts, but his hands remained steady on the rifle. "Final offer," the foreman called. "We've got schedules to keep, and you're causing delays." Chaska rose slightly, sighting down the Sharps barrel. Range was manageable, wind steady from the southwest. One shot to send a message, then they'd need to move fast before return fire found them. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the foreman's hat flew off in a spray of felt and dust. The man's horse reared as the bullet kicked dirt inches from its hooves, suddenly transforming the desert into chaos. "Mount up!" Chaska shouted, grabbing Marguerite around the waist and lifting her onto his horse. She cried out as movement jarred her wounded legs, but there was no time for gentleness. He swung up behind her arm, clamping around her waist to hold her secure, and kicked the horse into a dead run toward the arroyo system that scarred the landscape like old wounds. Bullets whined overhead, one close enough to feel its heat. The horse stretched into a gallop across hardpan and scattered stone, while behind them 3 riders gave chase with grim determination of men accustomed to collecting what they came for. The arroyo was deeper than it appeared from distance. A dry wash carved by flash floods, with steep banks and bottom lined with smooth stones and bleached bones of animals caught in wrong places when water came. Chaska guided the horse down the bank in a controlled slide, stones rattling around them, like bullets. "Stay low," he commanded, feeling Marguerite duck against his chest. The wash walls would provide cover, but also created a trap if riders got ahead and blocked exits. One pursuing horse stumbled in loose sand at the bank's top, its legs snapping with a sound like breaking wood. The animal screamed a sound that cut through desert air like a blade and went down hard, pinning its rider. The man's companions didn't hesitate. One drew his pistol and ended the horse's suffering with a single shot, then helped drag their associate free. "Blast the animal for costing us time." The foreman snarled, his voice carrying into the wash. "Mount double and stay after them." Pike's expectations don't include failure. Chaska guided the horse along the wash bottom, using every twist and turn to stay out of sight. Walls rose 15 feet on either side, carved smooth by decades of flash floods. In some places, the passage narrowed until stirrups SC. Era, accurate note, narrative integrated. Before the detonation, they unspooled twin copper leads from the charges back to a hand-cranked blasting machine magneto. The line was tested with a small spark, the circuit confirmed, and only then did the operator draw the handle to send current through the leads and fire the caps. Raped stone. In others, it opened into chambers where stunted mesquite had taken root in sandy soil. "Why do they want the device so desperately?" he asked, his breath warm against Marguerite's ear. "Papa discovered something," she replied, barely above a whisper. The compass wasn't just detecting copper. It was mapping an entire vein system that runs directly beneath the sacred burial hill near Bad River. Pike wants exact locations so he can route his railroad for mining access. Understanding clicked in Chaska's mind, like tumbler locks falling into place. The burial hill was where Lakota had died, at the same sacred ground his people had fought to protect. If Pike intended to drive railroad through it for mining access, consequences would extend far beyond simple grave robbing. "The tracks are just the beginning," he said grimly. "Pike's planning to strip mine Lakota burial grounds." Marguerite nodded against his chest. Papa realized what they intended when he saw the complete survey plans. That's when he tried to disappear with the device. But they caught him before he could reach safety. Above them, hoofbeats echoed against arroyo walls as pursuers paralleled their course. The men knew country well enough to predict where washes would emerge, positioning themselves accordingly. Chaska needed an exit that would provide maneuvering room, or they'd be caught in open ground when the wash finally ended. "Hold tight," he murmured, feeling Marguerite's small hands grip his forearms. "We're leaving the wash soon, and it's going to be rough country ahead." As they approached where the bank was low enough to climb, Chaska spotted movement above the silhouette of a rider against sky, waiting with patience of a man who knew his prey had limited options. The trap was closing with methodical precision, and they were running out of places to run. The Cheyenne River crossing lay 20 miles across terrain that seemed designed by hostile gods to test both horse and rider. Jagged mesas rose like ancient fortresses, their red sandstone faces carved into impossible spires by wind and weather. Between them stretched flats of alkali and sage that offered no concealment from watching eyes broken by arroyos that could hide ambushes or provide desperate refuge depending on circumstances. Marguerite's condition deteriorated rapidly as the sun climbed higher. Fever burned through her body where she leaned against Chaska's chest, and the wounds on her legs had taken on an ominous blue-gray discoloration that spoke of metal poisoning working through her system. "The grid they used," she explained during a brief rest, while Chaska checked his horse's hooves. It wasn't just heated iron. Papa wrote about copper arsenic alloys used in mining equipment, and the salts leach through skin and poison the blood gradually but fatally. The revelation explained her worsening state. She wasn't simply suffering from trauma and exhaustion. but from actual metal toxicity that would kill her without proper medical treatment. Boone and Echo Crossing was their only hope, but she remained hours away, across increasingly dangerous ground. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they found shelter among basalt formations that jutted from earth like ruins of some primordial civilization. Chaska built a small fire from dried grass and twigs, barely enough flame to heat water, but sufficient for his immediate needs. From his medicine pouch, he withdrew yarrow leaves gathered the previous summer, crushing them between his palms to release their healing properties. "This will hurt considerably," he warned, kneeling beside Marguerite as she bit down on leather to muffle cries. "But I need to clean metal fragments before poison spreads further." Working by firelight, he used his knife tip to extract blackened slivers from the deepest wounds, each one drawing muffled screams from between her clenched teeth. The metal had fragmented when it seared her skin, leaving tiny pieces embedded like splinters of agony. As he worked, he found himself counting movements aloud. "Breathe with me now. Count the pulls," giving her something to focus on besides pain. When he finished cleaning the wounds, he applied poultices made from boiled yarrow and strips of clean cloth torn from his shirt. The plant would help draw toxins and prevent infection, but it was field medicine at best. She needed real medical attention, and soon. "There," he said softly, sitting back on his heels. "That should help until we reach the doctor." Marguerite's eyes met his across the small fire, and he saw something new there, trust mixed with recognition of the intimate nature of what had passed between them. He had seen her pain, touched her wounds, heard her cry out in vulnerability, and she had permitted it all without question. "Thank you," she whispered, her accent making simple words sound like music. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "What's your name? I mean your real name, not what white folks call you." "Chaska," he replied, surprised by the question. "It means firstborn son in Lakota, though that hardly matters now since your brother died," she finished gently. "I'm sorry. What was his name?" "Dakota. It means friend to everyone. He was optimistic about the possibility of peace between our peoples." Chaska stared into the fire, remembering. "He believed cooperation could preserve what remained of our lands. I thought I believed it too until they killed him for defending a burial ground." Their quiet conversation was shattered by the dry whir of a rattlesnake's warning emanating from somewhere near Marguerite's bare feet. The serpent had coiled beside a sun-warmed rock, its diamond-patterned body thick as a man's wrist, head raised and ready to strike. Chaska moved with liquid speed, his blade appearing in his hand and pinning the snake's head to stone with surgical precision. The body thrashed wildly before going still. He flung the carcass into darkness where scavengers would dispose of it. "Rattlers hunt after dark," he explained, noting Marguerite's wide eyes. "They're drawn to warmth and the scent of blood." As if summoned by the disturbance, a chorus of yips echoed from surrounding darkness, coyotes drawn by blood scent and the promise of easy prey. Yellow eyes reflected firelight from multiple directions, and Chaska counted at least 6 animals circling their position. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sharp crack sending the pack scattering but not far. They regrouped beyond the firelight's reach, patient as death itself. "They'll wait," Chaska said, settling against a rock and drawing Marguerite close beside him. He spread his deerskin blanket over both of them, sharing warmth against sudden cold that came with nightfall in high desert. "Coyotes are intelligent hunters. They understand that wounded prey eventually weakens enough to become vulnerable." She fit naturally against his side, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as if it belonged there. In firelight, and he noticed old scars on his hands, souvenirs of childhood accidents and adult conflicts, and was surprised when she traced one lightly with her fingertip. "How did you get this one?" she asked quietly. "Knife fight with a drunk prospector when I was 16, he replied. He objected to the color of my skin, and I objected to his attitude about it." Her laugh was soft and unexpected, like water over stones. "Papa always said the frontier was hard on people who couldn't adapt. I think he meant it as fair warning." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to coyotes maintain their vigil and watching sparks rise toward stars that seemed close enough to touch. When dawn came, it brought a dust devil that scattered their fire and sent them scrambling to break camp before pursuers could close remaining distance. But in those quiet hours between dangers, something had shifted between them. Trust was growing into awareness that went beyond simple survival necessities. When Chaska helped her onto the horse, his hands lingered longer than required. When she settled against his back for the day's ride, she leaned into him with complete confidence that he would keep her safe. The Cheyenne River still lay ahead, and beyond it, Echo Crossing with its promise of medical help. But they were no longer simply a warrior and wounded woman thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming partners bound by shared danger and growing trust, riding toward uncertain futures with only each other to depend upon. As they descended toward the river crossing, Chaska spotted fresh horse tracks in mud along the bank. Their pursuers had anticipated this route and were waiting somewhere ahead, patient as spiders in a web, slowly tightening around them. Echo Crossing squatted beside railroad tracks, like a collection of wooden boxes thrown down by careless children. Main Street was a muddy strip between false-fronted buildings, the freight depot bustled with constant activity, and the telegraph office maintained its rhythmic chatter of messages flowing toward distant cities along copper wires. Dr. Lila Boone's surgery occupied 2 rooms above the general store, accessible by an external staircase that protested every footstep. The doctor herself was a woman of 30, widowed when her husband died in a mine explosion 2 years previous, who had remained in Echo Crossing from stubbornness and practical understanding that frontier communities needed healers more than conventional propriety. "Copper arsenic poisoning, definitely," she confirmed after examining Marguerite's wounds, her experienced hands gentle despite clinical precision. "Whoever did this used a telegraph line battery wired to a metal grid containing the alloy. Its particularly vicious torture electrical current drives metal salts deep into tissue." She applied laudanum tincture sparingly, knowing the drug was precious on the frontier, then prepared poultices of charcoal and egg white to draw out toxins. "She needs rest and clean water," Dr. Boone told Chaska. "The poison will work through her system, but it requires time." "Time we may not have in abundance," Chaska replied grimly. Through the surgery window, he had spotted Sheriff Tolliver making rounds, a heavyset man whose badge carried less authority than railroad money lining his pockets. Dr. Boone followed his gaze and nodded understanding. "Tolliver takes Pike's coin, but he's not the only one in town with divided loyalties. There are decent people here if you know where to look." A knock at the surgery door interrupted them. Silas Dunn stood on the landing, a weathered homesteader of 40, whose hands bore permanent stains of honest labor. He carried a basket containing fresh milk bread warm from the oven and early apples from trees he'd coaxed into bearing fruit in the harsh climate. "Heard you had patients?" he said, simply setting the basket down without ceremony. "My boy mentioned seeing riders heading this way, figured you might need supplies." Chaska recognized the debt being acknowledged. The previous summer, he had pulled Silas's 8-year-old son from the path of a grass fire that would have consumed both child and homestead. It was the kind of obligation that meant everything on the frontier, where survival often depended on neighbors' willingness to help each other against hostile land. "Much obliged," Chaska said, meaning it. Your boy doing well. Growing like prairie grass and twice as stubborn. Silas replied with tired pride of a single father. He's been asking when the Indian who saved him would return. Says he wants to show you how he's learned to read animal sign. Another knock interrupted, more hesitant, accompanied by rustling skirts. Eliza Hart climbed the stairs with measured dignity of someone maintaining authority in difficult circumstances. She was a school teacher who had converted an old freight car into a classroom determined to bring education to Echo Crossing's children despite the town's rough character. "I brought these," she said, producing papers tied with string. Anonymous letters that have been appearing around town exposing some of Pike's business practices. Someone's documenting his bribes and land acquisitions, but they're too frightened to sign their name. Chaska examined the papers, noting careful handwriting and detailed knowledge of railroad contracts and federal land policy. Whoever was writing possessed access to information few people in Echo Crossing would have. "Any idea who?" he asked. Eliza's glance toward the window was answer enough. Down on the street, Deputy Tom Calder walked his patrol with the heavy gait of a man carrying more weight than his years should require. At 28, he looked a decade older, his face bearing marks of someone who drank too much and slept too little. "Tom's got gambling debts to Pike's foreman," Dr. Boone explained quietly. "But he's not evil, just weak and in over his head. I think guilt is consuming him alive." As evening fell, Chaska positioned himself by the surgery window to maintain watch while Marguerite rested. Fever was breaking, but she remained weak and needed uninterrupted sleep to heal. He had borrowed Dr. Boone's field glasses and was scanning the street when he spotted movement that didn't belong a shadow, testing the surgery door before melting back into the alley. Without hesitation, he slipped downstairs and gave chase, his moccasins silent on muddy boardwalk planks. The intruder had reached the rooftops, leaping between buildings with agility of someone familiar with the town's layout. Chaska followed his frontier-honed reflexes, matching the man's pace, despite treacherous footing on rain-slick shingles. The chase ended beside rain barrels behind the hotel where Chaska tackled his quarry and sent both sprawling in mud. In the brief struggle that followed, he managed to seize a torn piece of fabric canvas bearing Pike's distinctive brand mark. The intruder escaped in darkness, but evidence was clear. Pike's men were watching the surgery, waiting for opportunity to finish what they had started. Back in Dr. Boone's surgery, Marguerite was awake and working at the small table where the doctor kept medical journals. She had found paper and pencil and was copying symbols from memory telegraph line code mixed with survey notations that told a story of corporate corruption and federal complicity. "I've been thinking about messages Papa received before he disappeared," she said, her voice stronger despite obvious exhaustion. "Pike's operation is larger than simple railroad construction. Look at this." She showed him a decoded message. "Trestle ready by new moon. Ore samples confirm high grade. Federal inspector bought and cooperative. Proceed with mineral survey under Burial Ridge." The words struck Chaska like physical blows. Pike wasn't just planning to desecrate Lakota burial grounds, he had corrupted federal officials to make it legal. The railroad was merely the first step. Once tracks were in place, mining operations would follow, stripping away sacred earth for profit. "There's more," Marguerite continued, hands shaking as she worked. "Route modifications, payoffs to territorial officials, even bribes to Army officers responsible for Indian relations. Papa documented everything before they caught him." Chaska felt her sway with exhaustion and moved quickly to steady her hands, gentle on her shoulders. "Enough," he said firmly. "You've done enough tonight." She resisted briefly dedication to her father's memory, driving her beyond physical limits. But when he guided her toward the cot Dr. Boone had prepared, she allowed herself to lean against him, forehead resting on his shoulder, for one unguarded breath that revealed the depth of her trust. In that moment, final barriers between them seemed to dissolve. She was no longer just a woman he was protecting, and he was no longer simply the warrior who had found her in the desert. They were partners in something larger than survival. A fight for justice that would determine whether Pike's vision of progress would triumph over the rights of people who had called this land home for generations. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain that would either wash away their tracks or trap them in Echo Crossing until Pike's men could close their net. Either way, time was running out, and the real battle was just beginning. The empty schoolhouse freight car sat on a siding behind the depot, its windows glowing with coal oil lamps. Inside, Eliza Hart was arranging primers and slates for the next day's lessons when Deputy Tom Calder appeared at the door. His badge-catching lamplight, like a guilty conscience, made manifest. "Miss Hart," he said, removing his hat with trembling hands. "I need to speak with you about those letters, and about the French girl and what's really happening here." Eliza set down her books carefully, noting how Calder's eyes darted toward shadows, as if expecting Pike's men to emerge at any moment. "Come in, Tom. Lock the door behind you." Calder did as instructed, and then stood in the center of the small space like a man who had forgotten how to sit. "I can't continue this charade," he said suddenly. "The lies, the blood money, watching Pike destroy innocent people for profit. It's eating me alive from the inside." "Then stop," Eliza replied with practical directness that made her an effective teacher. "Help us instead." What Calder revealed in the next 20 minutes shattered everything Chaska and Marguerite thought they understood about their situation. Etienne was alive, imprisoned in the sealed lower shaft of the old Copper Gulch mine, forced to use his electromagnetic compass device to map the precise location of copper veins running beneath the Lakota burial ridge. "Pike's been holding him for 3 weeks," Calder confessed, voice barely above whisper. "Making him survey routes that will give the railroad direct access to the richest part of the mineral deposit. But that's not the worst revelation. Worst. The grid burns on Marguerite's legs weren't random torture. They were a precise map coordinates etched in flesh and agony to coerce Etienne into providing mineral detection codes that would guide Pike's mining operation. Pike had captured her first, used her as leverage against her father. And when Etienne tried to resist, he had ordered the telegraph line battery torture that left her branded with the very information Pike needed. He's got surveyors who knew too much buried in unmarked graves. Calder continued producing a leather-bound ledger from inside his coat. Men who realized what Pike was truly after and tried to back out. Look here, receipts for galvanic cells, compass components, payments to men who asked no questions about their work. Chaska studied the entries, recognizing names of men who had supposedly died in accidents or simply vanished into the territory's vastness. The ledger was evidence of systematic murder, but more than that, proof of conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. But before Calder could explain more, the schoolhouse door exploded inward. Sheriff Tolliver filled the frame with Pike's foreman and 2 gunmen behind him, their weapons already drawn. "Well, well," Tolliver drawled, hand resting on his pistol grip. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little conspiracy meeting here." What followed happened in seconds that stretched like hours. Eliza's lantern shattered as Tolliver knocked it aside, kerosene igniting in a pool of flame that began licking at wooden walls. Calder tried to draw his weapon, but was clubbed down by the foreman's rifle butt, blood streaming from his scalp as he collapsed. A support beam, weakened by previous repairs and stressed by the spreading fire, chose that moment to give way. It crashed down with the sound of splintering timber crushing Silas Dunn's supply wagon as he pushed his young son clear into Chaska's protective embrace. "Papa!" The boy screamed, reaching toward wreckage where his father lay pinned beneath burning wood. But Silas was beyond help. His final act, the preservation of the son who meant everything to him. In the confusion, rough hands seized Marguerite despite her struggles binding her wrists, while the precious brass device was torn from her desperate grasp. Pike's foreman secured it in his saddlebag like a trophy, while flames spread through the freight car's interior. "You're coming with us," Tolliver announced, gesturing toward Chaska with casual authority. "Pike wants to discuss terms for ending this interference with legitimate business." "What terms?" Chaska demanded, though he already knew the answer. "Silence and cooperation in exchange for quick deaths instead of lingering ones," the foreman replied with chilling practicality. Pike's reasonable when people are reasonable with him. It was obviously a lie. Pike couldn't afford witnesses with so much money at stake and federal investigators already asking questions. But the immediate priority was getting Marguerite away from these men and finding a way to rescue her father before Pike decided both French immigrants had outlived their usefulness. As they were herded toward waiting horses, Chaska caught Dr. Boone's eye and nodded toward the child in his arms. She understood immediately, moving to take the boy while whispering, "I'll get him to Eliza. She'll keep him safe." The ride to Copper Gulch took place in gray hours before dawn, with Marguerite bound across a saddle like cargo, while Chaska was forced to mount a LED horse under constant threat of rifle barrels. The device that had started everything now rode in the foreman's saddlebag, its brass surface gleaming dully in early light. But Chaska had noticed something Pike's men missed in their haste. Calder's ledger had fallen beneath burning schoolhouse debris, hidden but not destroyed. If they could survive what was coming and get word back to Echo Crossing, that evidence might still bring Pike to justice. The question was whether any of them would live long enough to see that day arrive. As sun climbed higher and Copper Gulch's ruins grew larger on the horizon, Chaska found himself thinking about Dakota and the burial ridge, where his brother's spirit rested. If Pike succeeded, that sacred ground would be stripped away for profit, the bones of generations scattered like worthless debris. That thought alone was enough to harden his resolve. Whatever Pike had planned for them at the mine, Chaska would find a way to fight back. Too many good people had already died for one man's greed, and the time for passive resistance was over. The storm struck at midday, like a wall of brown fury, turning the world into a swirling hell of sand and wind that reduced visibility to arm's length. Pike's men had been riding hard toward Copper Gulch when the dust wall rolled across the landscape like an advancing tide, forcing horses to stop and riders to cover faces against stinging grit. In the chaos, violence erupted without warning. A rifle cracked somewhere in the blinding murk, the bullet grazing Chaska's shoulder and sending fire down his left arm. Horses shrieked in terror as they milled about, unable to see obstacles or direction, while men shouted curses, immediately swallowed by howling wind. Marguerite's scream cut through the noise as rough hands seized her, binding her to a mule with rope that bit deep into her wrists. The brass device was torn from her desperate grasp, passed to Pike's foreman, who secured it like the treasure it represented. In swirling brown darkness, she caught one last glimpse of Chaska struggling against two men before the storm swallowed him completely. When wind finally died and dust settled, Chaska found himself alone with Dr. Boone, who had followed from Echo Crossing with medical supplies and determination that matched her professional competence. She bound his shoulder wound with strips torn from her apron, movements quick and efficient despite harsh conditions. "They took her to the mine," she said grimly, squinting toward the distant headframe of Copper Gulch. "I saw them loading her onto that mule before the storm hit full strength." "The boy?" Chaska asked, wincing as she tightened the bandage. "Safe with Eliza. That child's been through enough trauma for one lifetime." Dr. Boone finished her work and stepped back, studying him with professional assessment. That shoulder needs proper attention, but it won't kill you if you're careful. Chaska tested his range of motion, noting how the wound pulled and burned with each movement. It would slow him and make shooting more difficult, but he'd fought with worse injuries before. Can you get word to the federal land agent in Bismarck? Already sent a telegram with what information I could piece together, she replied. But even if he responds immediately, help won't arrive for days. That girl doesn't have days. The truth settled over them like dust that continued drifting on afternoon breeze. Pike had what he wanted now, the device, the woman who understood its operation, and presumably her father's expertise in mineral detection. There was no reason to keep either French immigrant alive once he had extracted necessary information. Chaska began tracking toward Copper Gulch, reading sign in churned earth left by horses and the distinctive marks of mule hooves. The trail led through increasingly broken country, across dry washes, and over ridges of red sandstone that offered both concealment and vantage points for observation. At the Cheyenne River ford, he paused to study the crossing. Water ran shoulder-deep and swift, stirred to muddy turbulence by the recent storm. He led his horse across carefully, current tugging at both horse and rider as they navigated the slippery shale bottom. By late afternoon, he had reached the outskirts of Copper Gulch's ruins, concealing himself in greasewood that provided cover while he studied Pike's operation. The mine head frame dominated the landscape, its wooden skeleton rising against sky like a monument to industrial ambition. Around its base, Pike had established a temporary camp complete with tents, supply wagons, and enough armed men to discourage casual interference. Through borrowed field glasses, Chaska counted at least a dozen rifles too many for direct assault, even if his shoulder hadn't been compromised. But as he watched the camp's routines, he began identifying weaknesses that might be exploited by someone willing to take calculated risks. The most encouraging development came from an unexpected source. Deputy Tom Calder appeared at the camp's edge just as sun touched the western horizon, moving with careful steps of a man who had made a decision that might cost his life. "I can't live with this anymore," Calder said when he found Chaska in the greasewood. Silas Dunn was a good man. He didn't deserve to die for Pike's greed, and neither do those French people. The deputy's face bore marks of a man who had been drinking, but his eyes were clear and hands steady. More importantly, he carried information that could change the tactical situation dramatically. "Pike's planning to blast through the burial ridge tomorrow night," Calder explained. "He's got dynamite staged at the mine, and he intends to use it to expose the copper vein regardless of what it does to sacred ground." "What about the prisoners?" "The Frenchman's been chained in the main shaft for weeks, forced to use that compass device to map mineral deposits. The girl's being held separately in one of the old storage chambers. Pike's keeping them alive until he's certain he has all the information he needs." Calder produced a hand-drawn map of the mine's layout, noting guard positions and the location of the dynamite cache. "There's an old ventilation shaft on the north side that connects to the main tunnel system," he said. "It's partially collapsed, but a determined man could crawl through if he was willing to risk cave-in." The plan that emerged from their whispered conference was desperate, but feasible. Calder would return to camp and disable the signal wire, controlling the arrival of Pike's supply train, buying them time to act. Meanwhile, Chaska would infiltrate the mine through the ventilation shaft, free the prisoners, and find a way to prevent destruction of the burial ridge. "What about after?" Calder asked. "Even if we succeed, Pike's got too much money and influence to face real consequences. Men like him don't go to prison, they just find new ways to get what they want." Chaska looked toward the head frame where Marguerite was being held, thinking about her courage and the trust she had placed in him. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance," he said grimly. As full darkness settled over Copper Gulch's ruins, Chaska began his approach to the mine. Each step sent pain shooting through his wounded shoulder, but he pushed forward with grim determination of a man who had run out of alternatives. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Marguerite waited for rescue that might never come. But failure wasn't an option. Too many people had already paid the price for Pike's ambition, and the sacred ground where his brother rested deserved better protection than corrupt officials and bought law enforcement could provide. The time for patience and negotiation was over. Now there would be only action and hope that justice might still be possible in a territory where money and violence had held sway for too long. The ventilation shaft was a tomb of collapsed timber and choking dust barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, and threatening complete cave-in with each careful movement forward. Chaska crawled through the passage he had discovered as a boy, exploring these hills, his wounded shoulders screaming protest with every inch of progress. The shaft had been partially blocked by a cave-in months earlier, forcing him to squeeze through gaps that scraped skin from his back and arms. Ancient timbers groaned ominously overhead, settled into configurations that seemed to defy gravity through sheer stubbornness. Air was thick with the smell of rotting wood bat droppings and the metallic tang of mineral-rich groundwater seeping through limestone walls. When he finally emerged into the main chamber, the scene that greeted him was worse than imagined. Etienne Delorme sat chained to a support beam, his beard white with exhaustion, and eyes bearing the hollow look of a man pushed beyond endurance. The brass electromagnetic compass device lay disassembled beside him, its complex innards exposed like mechanical entrails. But there was something else, something that made Chaska's blood run cold. The device wasn't just a mineral detector. Hidden compartments in its brass casing contained what appeared to be surveying instruments of unusual sophistication and coiled copper wire that seemed to serve no purpose related to mineral detection. "Margot." Etienne called weakly across the cavern when he spotted Chaska. "Hold fast, ma petite. Help has come at last." "What is that?" Chaska whispered urgently, pointing to the additional equipment as he worked to free Etienne's chains. "Telegraph line, telegraph key." Etienne replied, strength returning to his voice. "I built it into the compass using modified military components, induction coils, and galvanic cells arranged to send coded signals. But Pike discovered it. That's why he's kept me alive, forcing me to decode the messages I sent to federal authorities." Two guards lounged beside a card table, their rifles leaning against wooden crates bearing distinctive markings of military dynamite. They died quietly, Chaska's knife finding vital spots with precision born of desperate necessity. He freed Etienne with swift cuts, noting how the older man's hands shook as feeling returned to his limbs. "Pike's going to blast the ridge tonight," Etienne whispered urgently. "He's got enough explosives to bring down half the hillside. The copper vein runs directly beneath the burial ground. He intends to strip it all away for profit." Before Chaska could respond, Pike's voice echoed through the chamber, followed by heavy footsteps of armed men approaching fast. "Light the test fuse," the railroad baron commanded with casual authority. "Time to see what sacred ground looks like when it's full of copper ore." The next few minutes dissolved into chaos, punctuated by gunfire and flame. Sheriff Tolliver appeared at the tunnel mouth, his rifle spitting lead that sparked off stone walls and support beams. A kerosene lantern shattered in the crossfire, igniting a wooden pillar and sending oily smoke billowing through the confined space. But as the battle raged, Chaska noticed something that changed everything. The brass device, when fully assembled with its hidden components, wasn't just a compass and telegraph key. It was also a sophisticated detonating device capable of setting off explosives by electrical signal from a distance. "The telegraph key," he shouted to Etienne over the gunfire. "Can you rig it to set off their dynamite?" "Oui, But we need to get closer to the charges, Etienne replied, working frantically with wire and electrical contacts. The signal won't carry far underground. Chaska threw a burning plank to drive back shooters, then dragged Marguerite from the storage chamber, where Pike had kept her bound and gagged. Her eyes met his with fierce gratitude, mixed with determination, and together they helped Etienne toward the tramway that led to the surface. The tramway system was a rickety collection of wooden tracks and cable-operated cars designed to haul ore from depths to surface processing areas. In its current state, with half the support cables frayed and several tracks warped by ground subsidence, it represented their only hope of reaching the half-built trestle spanning the flood-carved gorge above. Storm clouds were gathering as they emerged from the mine, promising the kind of sudden deluge that could turn the gorge into a raging torrent within minutes. Wind was already picking up, sending dust devils across the landscape and making the trestle timbers groan with stress. Pike and Tolliver pursued them onto the structure with grim determination of men whose fortunes depended on silencing witnesses. The railroad baron moved with surprising agility for his age-black coat whipping in wind as he balanced on rain-slick beams above churning water below. Pike's eyes fixed on Chaska with cold calculation. "This land, like your people, only has value when it's dug up and sold," he said with chilling matter-of-factness. "Nothing personal, just economics." When his gaze shifted to Etienne, Pike's voice carried the tone of a man discussing livestock. "Excellent mind, truly. Waste to bury it with his secrets." The confrontation that followed played out on multiple levels simultaneously: physical combat on treacherous beams of the half-completed trestle, moral conflict between opposing visions of progress and preservation, and emotional resolution of bonds that had formed between Chaska and Marguerite through shared danger and growing trust. But it was Marguerite who provided the key to victory. As Pike closed in on them, she suddenly understood her father's device completely. "The wire," she shouted. "Papa, the copper wire in the compass can conduct the detonation signal if we can get it to the dynamite." Working together, while Pike and Tolliver closed in, the three of them managed to rig the device to the trestle's central support beam, where Pike had placed his explosives. The approaching train whistle echoed across the landscape. Calder's sabotage had only delayed the supply run, not prevented it entirely. "The signal!" Etienne gasped, blood frothing on his lips from a bullet wound. "Margot, you must send the signal when Pike is directly over the charges." Tolliver charged along the beam with his rifle raised, but Etienne tackled the corrupt sheriff in a desperate gambit that sent both men tumbling toward the edge. The older Frenchman took Tolliver's bullet in the chest, but managed to knock the lawman off balance, sending him plummeting into the gorge below, with a scream quickly swallowed by rushing water. Pike made one last desperate grab for the compass device, but Marguerite had already triggered the electrical signal. The central span of the trestle exploded in a shower of timber and steel, Pike's mouth forming a perfect O of surprise before he tumbled into the void, while the approaching train's brakes screamed as the engineer fought to stop before plunging into the gap. In the aftermath, as dawn light revealed the full scope of destruction, Chaska cradled Marguerite against his chest, while she wept for her father's sacrifice. Around them, evidence of Pike's conspiracy lay scattered like bones of some prehistoric beast, ledgers and contracts, and survey maps that told the story of corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. "It's over," she whispered against his shoulder, tears mixing with dust and smoke that still hung in the air. "No," Chaska replied, voice gentle but certain. "Now it begins. Now we make sure their deaths meant something." The burial ridge stood intact in the distance, its sacred ground protected by sacrifice and determination. But the larger battle for justice in a territory where money and influence too often trumped law and decency was far from over. The smoldering ruins of Copper Gulch Mine cast long shadows in morning light, while shattered remains of the trestle lay scattered across the gorge like bones of some massive beast. Smoke still rose from burning timber, and the acrid smell of dynamite hung in air, like a memorial to violence and greed that had finally been brought to account. Dr. Lila Boone arrived with the son leading a small caravan that included Eliza Hart Silas's orphaned boy and Deputy Tom Calder, who bore the weight of his recent choices in every line of his posture. They brought medical supplies, clean water, and the kind of practical compassion that frontier communities offered in times of crisis. "Let me see that shoulder," Dr. Boone commanded, kneeling beside Chaska, where he sat with Marguerite's head resting against his chest. The wound had reopened during the night's violence, but it was clean and would heal properly with attention. Calder stood apart from the group, his badge absent from his vest, and his face bearing the hollow look of a man who had confronted his own cowardice and found it lacking. "I'll testify," he said quietly, voice carrying across the debris field. "Federal investigators, territorial courts, whoever wants to hear the truth about Pike's operation." From his coat, he produced the ledger that had survived the schoolhouse fire pages of meticulous records, documenting bribes, murders, and systematic corruption of federal land policy. Combined with evidence from Etienne's compass device, it painted a comprehensive picture of criminal conspiracy that reached far beyond one man's greed. Calder's face showed deep lines of exhaustion as he spoke. Pike bought judges, territorial officials, even army officers responsible for Indian relations. The railroad was just the beginning. He planned to strip mine half the sacred sites in the territory, selling minerals to eastern markets while claiming federal protection for industrial development. Marguerite lifted her head from Chaska's shoulder, green eyes still bright with unshed tears, but voice steady with resolve. "Papa knew," she said softly. "That's why he built the telegraph key into the compass. He understood Pike would kill anyone who threatened the operation, but he believed the truth would eventually surface." She opened the brass device's hidden compartment, revealing not just survey equipment, but carefully documented evidence of Pike's systematic bribery of land office officials. The railroad baron had purchased mineral rights to Lakota burial grounds through fraudulent surveys and corrupted federal policy crimes that carried penalties severe enough to bring down his entire organization. "Your father was a brave man," Chaska set his hand gentle on her shoulder. "He died protecting something more important than profit." The federal land agent arrived from Bismarck 3 days later, accompanied by U.S. Marshals in urgency that suggested Washington was finally taking territorial corruption seriously. Evidence against Pike's organization was overwhelming, leading to arrests that reached into the territorial capital and beyond. Using the combination of Eliza's anonymous letters, Calder's testimony, and documents from Etienne's compass, investigators traced the full scope of Pike's conspiracy. Railroad contracts were revoked, mining claims invalidated, and the proposed route through Lakota burial grounds permanently abandoned. In the immediate aftermath, practical concerns demanded attention. Dr. Boone established a permanent clinic in Echo Crossing, training Marguerite as her assistant in recognition of the young woman's intelligence and dedication to helping others. The work gave Marguerite purpose while she grieved her father's death, and her natural compassion made her well-suited to frontier medicine. Silas's boy found a home with Eliza Hart, who understood that education and stability were the best gifts she could offer an orphaned child. The teacher helped him plant a cottonwood sapling by the river, using the ceremony as opportunity to explain how life continued even after devastating loss. Chaska performed his own rituals for the dead, burning tobacco leaves at sunset in accordance with Lakota custom, while offering prayers for Etienne's spirit and peaceful rest of all those who had died fighting Pike's greed. The ceremony took place on the burial ridge that had been saved from desecration, with red hills stretching away toward a horizon that seemed to hold more promise than threat. 3 months after Pike's death, Echo Crossing had settled into rhythms of daily life that reflected both continuity and change. The railroad still brought commerce and occasional trouble, but federal oversight ensured development occurred within legal boundaries that respected both practical necessity and cultural preservation. On a cool evening in late October, when cottonwoods along the Cheyenne River had turned gold and air carried the promise of winter, Chaska rode to the Red Hills, where he had first planned to make offerings for his brother's spirit. The ridge rose against sunset, like a monument to persistence, and sacrifice its slopes unmarked by mining scars or railroad cuts. Marguerite was waiting for him at the summit, having ridden out from town on the gentle mare Dr. Boone had insisted she learn to handle. She had become an accomplished rider during her months on the frontier, adapting to demands of a life that required mobility and self-reliance. "I brought this," she said, holding out the brass electromagnetic compass device that had started their entire ordeal. "I don't want to carry it anymore. Too many painful memories." Chaska studied the instrument that had caused so much pain and death, noting how its brass surface had tarnished during the months since Pike's defeat. It was impressive craftsmanship representing the kind of technological innovation that could benefit humanity when used responsibly. But in wrong hands, it had become a tool of greed and destruction. Instead of taking the device, he reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small bone bead, carved with traditional symbols representing protection and new beginnings. "Carry this instead," he said, placing it in her palm and closing her fingers around it. "It will remind you that some journeys end so others can begin." She looked down at the bead, noting careful craftsmanship and warmth it seemed to hold, even in cool evening air. "What about you? What journey are you beginning?" Chaska gestured toward landscape spread below them, rolling hills stretching toward distant mountains, the silver thread of river marking a path through terrain that could be harsh but also beautiful for those who understood its ways. "I'll scout the new railroad route, make sure it stays where it belongs. The burial ridge needs protection, but so do the people who will follow tracks to new lives in this territory." It was practical work that would keep him traveling between communities, ensuring development occurred within legal frameworks that federal oversight had established. More than that, it was meaningful work that honored both his brother's memory and his own commitment to justice. They stood together on the ridge as stars appeared in darkening sky, two people whose lives had been forever changed by their encounter in the desert months earlier. The bond between them had evolved through shared danger and mutual trust into something deeper, a recognition of partnership that transcended immediate circumstances that had brought them together. "The clinic keeps me busy," Marguerite said quietly, "but Echo Crossing feels like home now. Dr. Boone says I have a gift for healing, and there's always more work than we can handle alone." She would keep the clinic's lantern lit for travelers and victims of frontier violence, offering the kind of practical compassion that could make the difference between survival and tragedy. It was demanding work that required both technical skill and emotional resilience, but it gave her life meaning beyond mere existence. As they prepared to ride back to town, Marguerite pressed a small packet into Chaska's palm, medical supplies wrapped in clean cloth, the kind of practical gift that demonstrated care without requiring elaborate explanation. He responded by tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with gentle precision, a gesture that conveyed more than words could express. "I'll make sure the path stays safe," he promised. "For you and for others who need protection from men like Pike." Their parting lingered longer than necessary, breath synchronizing in cool air as they stood beside their horses in fading light. No vows were spoken. Frontier life was too uncertain for promises that might prove impossible to keep. But understanding passed between them, acknowledgement that their paths would continue to intersect as their work brought them back to Echo Crossing and the surrounding territory. The final surprise came 2 weeks later, when Eliza Hart was sorting through donated books for the school and discovered an old survey sheet hidden between pages of a spelling primer. The paper bore Etienne's careful handwriting and detailed drawings, a complete alternate route for the railroad that would avoid all sacred sites while maintaining engineering feasibility and reasonable construction costs. The document was dated weeks before Etienne's disappearance, proving he had mailed it secretly to the school before Pike's men captured him. More importantly, it demonstrated that Pike had ignored readily available alternatives in his determination to access mineral deposits beneath the burial ridge. His entire conspiracy had been motivated purely by greed rather than necessity. Framed above the telegraph key in Echo Crossing's depot, Etienne's survey served as both memorial and reminder. Marguerite would hear the constant clicking of messages traveling along honest wires, but she no longer flinched at the sound. The codes that had once represented torture and loss now carried only news and commerce information traveling freely across a territory where corruption was being replaced by legitimate governance. Standing in the depot one morning, watching autumn sunlight stream through windows that no longer needed to be barred against Pike's violence, Marguerite felt the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. Her father's sacrifice had meaning, the sacred ridge remained protected, and the future held possibilities extending far beyond mere survival. On the red hills where the burial ridge stood intact, beneath the vast Dakota sky, wind stirred grass and a hawk wheeled in lazy circles. The sacred ground held its secrets and peace, protected by sacrifice and defended by those who understood that some things were worth more than profit. Chaska's work continued, taking him along the new railroad route and through communities where his reputation for integrity and practical wisdom opened doors once closed to Native Americans. Progress was possible. He had learned, but only when guided by principles that respected both human dignity and the land that sustained all life. In Echo Crossing, Marguerite tended the sick and injured with skills that honored her father's memory, while building something new and hopeful for the future. The frontier remained dangerous, but it was no longer ruled by men who believed might made right. And sometimes, when work was done, and evening settled over the town like a gentle benediction, two people who had found each other in the desert would sit together and watch stars appear in the endless sky, knowing they had played their part in making the world measurably more just than they had found it. The brass compass device found its final resting place in the school museum, where children could study its mechanics while learning about the importance of using knowledge responsibly. Its hidden compartments had been revealed. Its secrets exposed its capacity for both good and evil, made clear for future generations to understand. In the quiet courtroom where Pike's surviving associates faced justice, testimony was given in measured tones that carried the weight of truth. When the verdicts were read, Echo Crossing citizens sat in respectful silence, breathing deeply for the first time in months. The shadow that had hung over their community had finally been lifted by people brave enough to stand against corruption. Justice had been served, love had been found, and the sacred ground remained protected. In a territory where money and violence had too often determined right from wrong, ordinary people had proven that courage and sacrifice could still triumph over corruption and greed.